We're here in a dark room because the lights don't want to turn on all the way, apparently.
Can we be fixed?
I'd hope so.
Off and on, off and off. Each week we come here, we get less.
Anyways, so we are going to try and pick up where we left off, but where on earth do we leave off? That's the question. So, very, very brief timeline.
Yeah, in the first century.
We're still in the first century, yes. I'll go on this side of the horse, we can run the other side. So, I'll be slightly more specific than the 30s. So around 33 AD, crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Resurrection. Then, since this is the history of the Christian church, the major event that would have happened shortly after this is Pentecost, which is usually considered the birthday of the church. Although, of course, the foundations go all the way back to Adam and Eve. So as time progresses, you have different events going on, such as the conversion of Paul, some of the first martyrdoms in the faith. One of the most notable ones is Saint James, one of the disciples of Jesus, because he was one of the disciples. He was a big deal. And one of the Herods decided to execute him, and then seeing that people really liked that, he's like, "Ooh, I should execute more of the disciples." And then he arrested Peter, and had not an angel let Peter free, Peter himself would have been executed. We go our merry way to around 48 to 51, depending on how we count out some of the events that St. Paul describes in Galatians. This is the Council of Jerusalem, the first council we know of in the Christian church, and it was deciding what are the place of Gentiles. That was the main focus. So you're talking to a whole bunch of Jews. You can convert Jews because that's just kind of how it was founded. But what about the Gentiles? Can they come in? And it was decided that they can. But that was actually more of the side issue to the actual foundational issue, which they had to argue through, which is how are you actually saved? And if you're saying you have to be saved by adherence to the law, well, then all Gentiles have to be under the law. They have to become Jews before they become saved. But if salvation is by grace through faith, as St. Peter and St. Paul were saying at the council, then that kind of floats away, that you first need to become a Jew and first need to become under the law. In fact, hopefully you've been listening to my sermons, falling asleep. But if you've been listening, and all the pastors, of course, if you've been listening, that you also know that you can't be saved by your works. The law doesn't help you; it can only condemn. It can tell you you're doing fine, or it can condemn you. So odds are it's just condemning you. So if you're actually doing the law and pushed to doing the law, then you've already been saved. Grace has come to you so that now, empowered by the Holy Spirit, you may actually do good works.
And was it the outcome of the council?
Oh, they weren't really talking about the placement of good works per se. They're more concerned with justification by faith. So how are you made righteous before God? And it can't be by works; it must be by grace.
And the council was made up of?
Well, we don't know exactly who was here, and we don't know exactly how big it was. But we do know there was James, the brother of Jesus, he was presiding. There was Saint Peter, there was Paul and Barnabas, who were relatively obscure characters until that time. And then there's quite a few others that we assume to be there, such as a few of the other disciples, but to know exactly who was there, yeah, we don't know. We need a time machine.
Keep minutes.
Yeah, that wasn't a priority back then, especially before the invention of paper. Oh, yeah, because that's one of the other things I was mentioning. I say at parchment. So in order for you to get more material to write on, first you had to slaughter a sheep or a bull or some animal, and then go through months-long process trying to convert the hide into parchment. So it takes some time.
So it's just Christians, there's no opposing.
Well, yeah, it's a council of the church, so there wouldn't be anybody else.
Okay, so it's not opposing.
Yeah, so for pretty much every single council in church history, it's always been a council of the church. They don't invite pagans to come in to help decide matters within the church.
But Constantine did,
No, he didn't.
no, but, okay. But he was a political man that made a decision.
Well, he decided to call the council, but he had no actual knowledge or interest in theology. He was just basically trying to calm the turmoil within the Christian community in his empire. Basically, he just said, okay, I'm calling this council, you guys figure it out. So the main groups involved there were Orthodox Christians, or what we would call Orthodox Christians, and Arians. And the actual matter for debate is Arianism the correct understanding of Christianity? So they weren't inviting pagans per se, but they were inviting people to actually decide within the church. So it was the decision of that particular council to say that Arianism was heresy. And at that point, they were kicked out. Which would be true for a lot of the other councils too, even before that. Yeah. Anyways. 4851. Then we also have need to put the circa in there, circa 67, so around 67 AD. We got the death of Saints Peter and Paul. And I was in a few previous studies trying to show that you have the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke sometime prior to this. As for the exact dates, it's hard to nail down. As with a lot of things in ancient history, it's hard to nail down exact dates. That's also why I had to put the circa C right there to say you don't exactly know. But traditionally, that has been taken as 67 AD, and there's no real reason to refute it. We just don't have any reason to say that's not what happened. So Mark was probably written mid to late 50s. Matthew, as I argued before, probably late 50s after Mark. However, there has been cases made that maybe Matthew came before Mark. I don't see that as a very good argument, but it is an argument that people make. And then Luke would most likely be written in the early 60s, because the book of Acts, which was written after Luke, ends with Paul in prison in Rome, which was around 62 AD. So odds are Luke was written in the early 60s when Luke and Paul were still in Jerusalem and Paul was waiting trial. That's my record. So last time we were together, I was focusing on the Jewish rebellion, which led to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem at large in 70 AD. So that's important because it reshapes the Jewish nation, because if you don't have a temple, you now have nowhere to worship, nowhere to offer sacrifices as mandated by the Old Testament. And if Jerusalem itself is destroyed, now you have over 1 million people who need some place to live. So this is one of the points of the diaspora, where Jews go everywhere. And since there are also a lot of Christianized Jews in Jerusalem at that time, Christianity also goes everywhere. And if Jews are trying to promote their own religion, Christians would actually have an easier time in that area because they just walk into the synagogue and go, oh, well, you already believe half the stuff. Let me tell you about Jesus. But this is also an important date for trying to figure out the Gospels, because they all have, well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the speech of Jesus, the Olivet Discourse. Last week, before he's crucified, on the Mount of Olives, he says, this temple is going to be destroyed. There will not be one stone left upon another. So depending on if you actually believe in prophecy or not, you're probably going to be dating these books here or here after this. And that's like an oversimplification of what's going on, but that's basically how people argue within the academic world is like, I don't believe in prophecy, therefore they have to have known about this and they have had to have written later than 70 AD. But yeah, if you believe in prophecy, putting them at this time is, yeah, it's no problem. Okay, so now we're going to 80, so this is St. John's work, so his gospel and letters. Should actually write out every letter before I start writing new words. Okay. Epistles. And around 96 is the book of Revelation. Around there. We, again, approximate dates. I've heard of it. I've never actually seen a research paper on it, but I've heard of an argument that Revelation actually came before the Gospel and the Epistles for John. But yeah, I haven't actually seen any research articles on it to see how they would justify that, but I just heard about it. So that's the last book written of the Bible. I'll make that a little bit there. So now what we're going to be doing today, we're going to look to extra biblical materials. Woo! Good.
So
Well, we have a few.
so this is everything out there on the internet.
Or in these books. What? Because yeah, again, this is being written with parchment, and this is also being written by people who could actually write. So if you're having a written source from this time period, it's going to be somebody who's been educated and who actually does have the resources to make a book. And if it survives in some way, shape, or form to the present day, then it was well known or published in vast quantities. This is also why we have thousands of fragments and even entire copies of books of the New Testament, as well as groupings of the New Testament, because they were printing tons of these things. Well, sorry, not printing, writing out. The printing press wouldn't be invented until, well, Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere, printing press not until 1400s. So the people at this time, if you're writing a book, odds are it's in large sizes, printed or copied in large sizes, because there's fires, there's floods, there's wars, there's thefts. So odds are, if you don't have a lot of copies of a manuscript, it's not going to survive. And if people like it enough, you will find fragments of it in later copies. As I was talking like a month ago about Papias, how he's the source on the origin of these books. But we don't have Papias's writings extant to any extent. So what we're relying on is a much later writer who quoted Pappus. So he was considered a valuable resource for information on the early history of the church. Therefore, we still have fragments from him. Yeah. So, 5 people means typically large quantities. So if we're looking to the early history of the church, beyond what we're gleaning from kind of the biblical narrative from when we first started getting writing, so this would be around the time when Galatians, the first writing in the New Testament, was being written, the Revelation. So a period of 50 years or so being written. We start seeing comments on some of the later stuff, beginning with some fellow called Josephus. And yeah, I was talking about him in relation to the destruction of Jerusalem. So Josephus, no, I should probably put him in the time scale. So Josephus would actually be writing or starting to make notes around here. So he was a Jew who was fairly important in his community. He was actually a commander of Jewish forces during the Jewish rebellion there against Rome. And he was taken prisoner, eventually convinced that he could convince the Romans that he could actually create some peace and negotiate between the Jews and the Romans. And afterwards, he was actually allowed to, and given money to write about the events. And that was his really big book, the Jewish War. Much later in life, he started writing the Antiquities, which was basically the Bible with some rabbinical notes. And then also including the intertestamental period, so between the New Testament and Old Testament. And then also some stuff in the New Testament. So he actually has a couple quotes of Jesus, or a couple quotes about Jesus, I should say. And yeah, he's one of the main sources that we have for how Jesus might have actually been viewed at this time.
Was he a contemporary or did he come later?
He was a oh shoot, sorry. I'll check my notes really fast. Because there's an approximate date for him. See if I can find his approximate dates. Oh, I didn't write them down. Anyways, out of memory, he was actually born, I believe, in the 40s.
Oh,
So he was actually born around this time.
well, he is a witness in many respects.
Yeah, so he was an adult at this time, so he could actually take up arms against Rome. And then he died around 100 AD.
Okay.
So his main bulk of writings was around the same time John was writing. So he was a contemporary of John, absolutely.
Well, that makes it so much more valuable.
Yeah.
You know.
So just grabbing. Of course, I didn't actually. Oh, there it is. Just one flag here. Nope, that's about Josephus. Yeah. So, in his later book, The Antiquities, which actually goes up to around the time that he's actually writing in the 90s, he has a statement about Jesus, where he's saying, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a human. For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by people of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now, since Josephus was a Jewish writer, and he's saying such things, Jesus, a wise man, even though he was condemned by the Jewish authorities, and he's also saying, if indeed one ought to call him a man, so kind of hinting maybe he's something more, also saying he was the Messiah, mentioning Pilate being crucified, dying, and on the third day coming to life. Yeah, obviously this is raised red flags for all the people who say, no, this can't possibly come from a Jewish guy. Kind of ignoring that all these guys were Jews. Anyways, so in Josephus, there's been some hypotheses about this particular passage. And basically the consensus is that this passage is authentic to Josephus, that he actually did write this, because we don't have any manuscripts which have this missing. We have this quoted by tons of Christian figures over centuries. So there's a lot of evidence to say that this is original to the text. But there's some suspicion that some of the manuscripts that we have, which come like hundreds of years after the time of Josephus, might have had something to the effect of, the Christians say this, just like cut out of the text. And like, hard to say. Because if Josephus really believed that Jesus was the Messiah, then he probably would have followed him, but we don't have evidence that Josephus was following Jesus. And we don't really know any much more than that. So it's kind of up in the air. Did Josephus actually believe this, or was he just giving an account of what Christians believe? And one of the scholars that I read, a translator of Josephus from the 1700s, his guess was that Josephus actually belonged to the Ebionites, an early Christian heresy, which believed that Jesus was adopted as God's son at his baptism instead of being God from the beginning. That way, Josephus could still deny certain things, but still have this good confession. Anyways, so that confession, coming up in the Antiquities, was from the 90s. Of course, when he was taking notes, the notes would have preceded the 90s, but that would have been about when Josephus first died. So now, we're going to flip over to one of the early Christian sources. Yay! Christians! And we're going to go to Saint Clement of Rome. Of Rome. Okay. Of course, everybody knows the letter of First Clement. Some of the background we have of Clement actually comes from a fellow called Irenaeus. Irenaeus was one of what's called apostolic fathers. Clement himself was an apostolic father, but he lived quite a few years before Irenaeus. But an apostolic father is basically somebody who has been taught by the apostles, or who has been taught by somebody who was taught by the apostles. So you don't have any of these apostolic fathers later than 200. So Irenaeus kind of comes up middle of the 2nd century, and he's writing about this. So one of the things that he's trying to focus on is battling against objections to the Christian faith. So Irenaeus has this really huge book called Against Heresies. And in it, he's just basically trying to address theological and even historical claims against Christianity. So in book 3 of Against Heresies, chapter 3, a refutation of the heretics from the fact that in the various churches, the perpetual succession of bishops was kept up. Now he's trying to argue that the teaching has been preserved between every single pastor in the church. And not just pastors, but bishops who were actually the teachers of the pastors. So in this chapter, he says, it is within the power of all, therefore, in every church, who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And we are in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times. Those who neither taught nor knew of anything like what these heretics rave about. So what he's saying here is every single congregation has been founded on the tradition of the apostles. Now, he doesn't spell it out right here, but the tradition of the apostles is actually preserved by the writings of the New Testament. And this is what's going to ground the Christian churches circulating these writings. But yeah, we focus on the tradition of the apostles and specifically how these are interpreted through the bishops, the people who are in charge. Because like, how often do you hear somebody come up with a crazy opinion about the Bible? All the time, right? So you need some guidelines to work with. So it would be best to have the bishops who were instituted by the apostles, and then their successors and their successors and their successors. And this is really, we're going to get, oh, maybe we won't. But we might get to the question of apostolic succession. What does that actually mean? This is really, really big in Catholicism, Orthodoxy, like Eastern Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism. Lutherans don't worry about it quite as much. And what they're going to say is we have bishops consecrated by previous bishops going all the way back to the apostles. Ignore the fact that we don't actually have records for this. Anyways, so they're focusing on that as apostolic succession. Whereas Lutherans will try to emphasize apostolic succession more in terms of this, the actual writings of the apostles. They're actually following the traditions. And Lutherans, we really had to try and think through this issue because during the Reformation, we didn't have any bishops convert over to Lutheranism right away. We eventually did. That's the Swedish church right now. But we didn't have any bishops who came over right away, which was an issue because at that time in Western Christianity, you could only be ordained by a bishop. Not any old pastor, you had to be ordained by a bishop. Lutherans didn't have any bishops, so how are we going to get any more pastors? So we really had to delve into the issue. Look into how the early church actually saw this as a bit of an arbitrary distinction between pastor and bishop, and that it was brought in for the form of good order, and it definitely was. But true apostolic succession follows with the teachings of the historic Christian church given throughout time. So you don't necessarily need to have an unbroken line of consecrated bishops, especially if you get, say, like shipwreck problem. You have a shipwreck on an island, you need somebody to be the pastor, but you don't have any pastor there. So the church, that group of Christians there, have to select a guy to become a pastor. Does he have valid ordination call? Yes. But he's not ordained by a bishop nor even a pastor. So this is recognizing, or Lutherans try to recognize that the call and the ordination comes from the church, but is best applied through the clergy. Best applied through the clergy, but it originates from the church alone.
And the criteria for teaching a pastor what to teach is everything on the left side there.
Not so much that one, but yes.
So you can say, if, go through this line by line kind of thing, and if you agree with that, then you're qualified to be a pastor.
Yeah. So we also have St. Paul writing 1 Timothy and Titus, because he's actually writing to St. Timothy, who he instituted as a bishop, and to Titus, who he also instituted as a bishop. And he's saying this is the criteria for a bishop/pastor.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we look to those books to try and see, well, are you actually qualified to be a pastor? And most people aren't. If you even ask pastors, like, are you qualified? Like, I'd say no, but by the grace of God have I come into this ministry, and only by the grace of God does he sustain it in spite of me. Yeah.
What qualification are you missing?
Hmm?
What qualification are you missing?
The
The fact that you're.
one that I'm not a sinless person, can exercise proper judgment at all times. But yeah, some of them are actually far more obvious, where like St. Paul says, it's not given to drunkenness or something of the sort. And if you have a lust for the pastor,
So
it's just gonna come up really, really fast. So yeah, don't have something like that.
But we're all sinners. So,
Oh yeah.
So.
Anyway, going back to Irenaeus, so he's arguing for unbroken line of apostolic succession, not just in line with bishops, but focusing also on the apostolic traditions as summarized by the apostles themselves in the Bible. Anyway, actually, I'll probably skip over that. So, since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome, the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of bishops. I'll include the last sign first. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolical tradition has been preserved continuously by those faithful men who exist everywhere. Okay, what is he saying? He's saying, I'm going to prove to these heretics that we have this unbroken line of apostolic tradition in bishops and in teaching. And I'm going to reckon this only through Rome, because if I look to every single church, it's going to take forever. So I'm going to do it with Rome, because since it was founded by Peter and Paul, like they were also killed in Rome, this is going to be the church that people are most going to agree with. Paul wrote half the books of the New Testament. Peter wrote only a couple, but Peter was also seen as like the representative of the apostles. Now he wasn't like the head. He wasn't necessarily the leader of the Christian church the whole time, because at the Council of Jerusalem, St. James, brother of Jesus, was the head. But with Rome, you have two apostles now living there and governing the church. So if you're going to have the people who wrote up the doctrine, then everybody should actually be agreeing with this church, because if they wrote up the doctrine and this church is following that doctrine, that apostolic tradition, this would be the church you should be in line with. Even in Eastern Orthodoxy, well, there's different emphasis over time and depending on who you ask in Eastern Orthodoxy. But at least some Eastern Orthodox have said that the bishop in Rome is the first among equals. So every single bishopric is the same because you don't have people above or below one another in terms of ordination. But within the structure of the church, it's good to have some sort of head or governing authority, so they just kind of say, well, you're the first among equals. This was more or less the model adopted by the English crown for quite some time. You're the first among equals. Now, of course, it's a legend, but think of King Arthur, you have a round table, everybody's equal, but that you still defer to King Arthur on matters of state. Again, that's a legend, that didn't actually happen, that's not what English subscribes to. But just as kind of a visual thing, that's what we're going with. So when, say, the Pope starts making overreaching claims, the Orthodox are within their abilities, powers, and everything else to say, you've gone too far, stop it. And they actually did that a few times, even before there was a great schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, which was actually a schism based on to what extent does the Pope have authority over the church. Anyways, I'm skipping ahead in time 1,000 years. Okay, back to this. So he's going to trace this through the Roman Church. Irenaeus is tracing this apostolic succession through the Roman Church, and he says the blessed apostles, Peter and Paul, then having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus, office of the episcopate. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. So yes, we actually do have evidence that Linus existed in the letters of Paul. And he was the succeeding bishop to the siege in Rome. So for the Roman Catholic Church, they're going to list Linus as the second pope after Peter. And yeah, he was a bishop after Peter. So yeah, we have no problem agreeing with this. So to him succeeded Anacletus, and after him in the third place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. This man, as he had seen the blessed apostles, so he's actually a companion with the apostles, and had been conversant with them, might be said to have the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears and their traditions before his eyes. Nor was he alone in this, for there were many who still remained who had received instructions from the apostles. So people could actually check up on him if he went off the rails. In the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians, exhorting them to peace, renewing their faith and declaring the tradition which it had lately received from the apostles, proclaiming the one God, omnipotent, the maker of heaven and earth, the creator of man, who brought on the deluge and called Abraham, who led the people from the land of Egypt, spake with Moses, set forth the law, sent the prophets, and who has prepared fire for the devil and his angels. From this document, whosoever chooses to do so may learn that he, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, was preached by the churches, and may also understand the apostolic tradition of the church, since this epistle is of older date than these men who are now propagating falsehood, the heretics, and who conjure into existence another God beyond the creator and the maker of all existing things. That was something the Gnostics were trying to do. So, and then after this, Irenaeus gets into Clement's successors.
Is he referencing the Corinthians books in the Bible, or is there another?
That's what we're going to get into now. So there's actually a letter of First Clement, and this was written around around 96, maybe a couple years afterwards, AD. So the time that Clement was writing his letter was around the same time that St. John was writing Revelation. So we actually have some of the earliest Christian literature that survives coming in at the tail end of the Bible. And if I recall, there was, at least at one point, an argument to try and say that the letter of Clement to the Corinthians should actually be included as canon in the scriptures. However, I haven't really found anything to really say that, yeah, this really should be put in. In fact, having read the letter of First Clement, I'd say there's good reason not to include it. Because there's actually a little bit in there about the phoenix and how it dies and rises from its own ashes. And this is an example from nature that the resurrection is real. So if we're actually arguing that the Bible is inerrant, we probably shouldn't include First Clement.
But if they know of each other or of each other's writing, it would influence them, you know.
It's hard to say exactly how much Clement had, because in the letter itself, and I'm also thankful for all the little footnotes here, but in the letter itself, there's a whole bunch of references to New Testament books. So, including Paul's letters to the Corinthians. So, Clement is definitely aware of the letters of St. Paul, the letters of Peter, and even the Gospels. But it's hard to say whether, like the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it's hard to say how much of John's writings he actually had. Most likely he did have John's Gospel and the epistles by this time. But I don't recall him ever mentioning the book of Revelation. Because if he did, that would also be very useful for us, because it's relatively easy to date St. Clement. So if we can date him and we have a reference to the book of Revelation, well, then it must have been written before that time, and then we have a nice solid date for the book of Revelation. Unfortunately, yeah, I don't think we do, which is why some people try to say Revelation was written 20 to 30 years later from that. Okay. And I would say that the letter of First Clement is fairly characteristic of early Christian writings. Most Christian writings at this time were about defending the faith or preaching the faith. So Clement, in doing this, what he was focused on the law. So do this. The Corinthians aren't doing this. Like decades after Paul gave them the letter and said, "Don't do that," they're doing something still. Although I think the same could be said for any congregation. It's just humans. Anyways. And what Clement tries to do is he tries to give examples. So then he references a whole bunch of Old Testament passages. Irenaeus already, he mentioned, say, like Abraham and Moses. So there's a whole bunch of Old Testament examples, what you're supposed to do in the faith. But even beyond this, Clement is mentioning things like a whole bunch of blessings that came from Christ. He's also talking about respecting the office of the priesthood, which comes from Christ. This is also a feature of Christian writings, that you're supposed to respect the priesthood, or at least defer to them in matters of doctrine. You can find this in John's letters, because there are heretics at the time that John is writing. So pay attention to the writings of the apostles and pay attention to the apostles themselves. St. Paul, also in some of his writings, is saying, pay attention to me, I am an apostle, I was sent by Jesus, I know what I'm talking about. Don't listen to these other people who say that they're apostles and teachers. So this is kind of par for the course and similar to some of the biblical passages. little bit extra light.
Genesis, oh, yeah, let there be light.
That's right.
But one of the more interesting passages to me, that's the passage of justification by faith. Because one of the arguments from Roman Catholics and from Eastern Orthodox against anybody who came out of the Reformation, that this isn't in the historical church. You have to still do a whole bunch of works, and those works give you some sort of grace. But of course, Rome won't say salvation. However, the grace that they're talking about is being free from purgatory so that you can live in heaven forever. And if you're not free from purgatory, which is a mandatory thing, then good luck to you. So we would still say that that's part of salvation. They wouldn't, but I would. So in Clement, what are you saying here in chapter 32? Because all the chapters are really small. So whosoever will candidly consider each particular will recognize the greatness of the gifts which were given by God, or from God, as from the priests and all the Levites who minister at the altar of God. So also respect those who came before you in the faith, the Levites, the Levitical priesthood. For from him also was descended our Lord Jesus Christ according to the flesh. And from him arose kings, princes, and rulers of the race of Judah, nor are his other tribes in small glory, inasmuch as God had promised, thy seed shall be as the stars of heaven. So that was a promise given to Abraham. All these therefore were highly honored and made great, not for their own sake or for their own works, or for the righteousness which they wrought, but through the operation of his will. And we too, being called by his will in Christ Jesus, are not justified by ourselves, nor by our own wisdom, or understanding, or godliness, or works, which we have wrought in holiness of heart, but by that faith, through which, from the beginning, Almighty God has justified all men, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. So yeah, justification through faith. Now Clement will also start talking later on in his epistle that if you're in faith, you also have to do works. Works necessarily flow from faith, as we find in the scriptures themselves. But yeah, he's saying you are not saved, you're not justified by your own efforts or by your disposition. It is only by faith. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any thoughts, questions, concerns before we move on to at least one other thing before we leave today? Okay. So before we get to some of the pagan writers who are commenting on the Christian faith, there is one other document that is very important. And this is the Didache. And of course, this means,
Never heard of him.
of course, no, it is teachings. The teachings. So we actually don't know who wrote this, but the name of the document is the teachings of the 12 apostles.
What language is that?
Greek, or a type of Greek.
What was that?
Didache, sorry.
Didache.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's better.
But if you really want to get into it, like this that's a guttural sound. So you go.
What did I say?
Anyways,
Where does it fit in time-wise? After then Clement?
it's really hard to date this particular word. So the writings that we have and the guesses that have been given are actually tying this with somebody called Saint Barnabas. And depending on when he lived, this might actually come up in 120 AD, and that's generally the mid-range number. But there have actually been guesses that this came out in 90, and then the later dates,
Okay, fine, but it's,
160.
uh,
But this was a very important early document, and it could have actually come up at the same time as the writing of John, but yeah, we just don't have enough information. Sadly, with ancient documents, you can never get the original autograph, the actual original document. You only have the manuscript, so you can try and date the manuscripts, but yeah, doing that is hard. You have to look for a lot of internal evidence. You don't find a lot of that in the Didache. It's actually a very short work.
So I do have a question. In the Council of Jerusalem, which is chaired by James.
Yeah.
Right? Does he have the equivalent position? Does St. Clement have the equivalent position in the church history? Like on the left side, I can kind of follow it, but on the right side, are they equivalent? Like, are they part of a church or are they outside of the church? Or?
So James would have been dead long before St. Clement came about. One of the other bits of Josephus's writing is an account of how St. James of Jerusalem was executed.
Right.
But if we're talking about position,
And is he executed by the government?
yeah, he was executed by one of the Herods.
Okay, so are they part of the left side? Are they working with?
Okay. So the left side, I'm just saying that's what I've covered so far. The right side is just kind of fitting into what we're all already
Yeah,
talking
so
about.
are they part of the hierarchy? Are they part of the church body, right? Are they working together? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
And
Well,
so
they
it's
weren't.
church.
They weren't in power at the same time. So I can't say that. But in terms of bishoprics, they would have been equal in power in the sense that James was bishop in Jerusalem. He was head over the church in Jerusalem. Clement was head over the church in Rome. So they would have been equivalent in authority, theoretically, anyways. However, since James was himself an apostle, he would have still had that little bit over. So in terms of the bishopric, they would have been equal, but James would have been over him as much as Peter and Paul would have been over St. Clement. Yeah.
Because of apostolic succession.
Well, yeah, because they were apostles who had received the teachings of Christ and were instructing the entire church according to that. Yeah. So Clement was kind of was the heir of these teachings, as every single teacher of the church was, and he would be exercising this to the best of his ability. Yeah. Yeah. So the Didache. So it's actually a fairly short work, and it's supposed to be a very short summary of the teaching of the apostles. I think it's somewhat deficient. There's no gospel in it, really. So it's yeah, fairly short. Let's see, only about that long. And it starts off with there are two ways, one of life, one of death. But a great difference between the two ways. Obviously, it's life and death. But yeah, so the first few chapters are talking about the way of life. And the way of life is summarized by various commandments as given in Scripture. Very much highlighting the Sermon on the Mount in the first one. And then some of the Old Testament laws in the next couple chapters. When it starts up with the way of death, it's saying the way of death is violating all these commandments. So you can kind of get a sense that, well, maybe, yeah, there's some hint towards the gospel that you need the gospel, but it doesn't really come up. But yeah, there's two ways, one of life, one of death. You follow God or you turn away from God. That's fairly scriptural, that's fairly apostolic, except that the apostles wouldn't forget the gospel, but just saying. There's a short chapter after that. So beware false teachers and don't have food sacrificed to idols. Then it starts talking a bit more about worship and the practices of the church, because there's a short chapter about baptism. So baptism considered very important. Fasting, repeating the Lord's Prayer. Lord's Prayer here is also said to be prayed 3 times a day. So presumably morning, afternoon, evening. So then there's prayers for the Eucharist, the meal of Thanksgiving, communion. So there's a prayer before, prayer afterwards, and also a note saying, let no one eat or drink of your Thanksgiving meal, but they who have been baptized into the name of the Lord, for concerning this also the Lord has said, give not that which is holy to the dogs. So we also see that there is at least some measure of closed communion even early on. Even a lot of the churches today which practice a more open form of communion still recognize that you need to be baptized before coming before the meal. And then there's comments about honoring teachers, apostles, and prophets. Beware of false prophets. Receive all Christians who come to you, and always assemble on the Lord's day. So worship weekly, worship together weekly. And then the closing chapter is be watchful for the coming of the Lord. So look to the end of the world when Christ comes again. So even though it seems to be a little deficient in certain areas, it gives us a nice snapshot of what the early Christian church at this time was really elevating. So proper following of the law, proper worship with words, sacraments, prayer, respect of the priesthood, and being watchful for the coming end of the world where you enter into paradise.
When you speak of the law,
Yep.
does that include all Jewish laws, or is it just?
Oh, no, more like the 10 Commandments type of laws.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other closing thoughts, questions? No? Okay. So next week, hopefully, we'll come into at least a couple of the other early Christian writers, some of the pagan writers who are commenting about Christianity, so you kind of get a nice snapshot of where things are at the turn of the 1st century. Yeah. Let us pray. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for giving to us your Son, Jesus Christ, that we may be saved through him. We thank you, O Lord, for all those you have saved through our Lord Jesus Christ, including those who lived in the early Christian church and who have given us the teachings of the apostles. We thank you, O Lord, that they remain steadfast in their time and have preached the word. And we ask you, O Lord, to guide us according to some of their work, so that we may see the glory of you and your Son from age to age. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.